At least three governments that I spoke to said that they'd quietly started planning for what happens in that scenario and how on earth you make NATO work without the Americans. So this is very serious and something that is being taken with a great degree of earnestness. And the second question, whether we can just sort of sit around and wait for this to blow over and then hopefully we'll get some sort of Biden 2.0 president. No one that we've spoken to in European governments or diplomatic services or militaries is kidding themselves that whatever comes after Trump will be materially different. If the US pulls troops out of Europe, it's highly unlikely that they will be coming back anytime in the years after Trump.
The Times takes an in-depth look at what's next for NATO today and gives you an inside account of its fight to survive. The alliance is reeling, of course, from the turbulence and uncertainty caused by President Trump's shifts in policy. Officials, military officers, diplomats and government advisors have revealed really something quite, I suppose, unsettling about the future of international security. The Times Berlin correspondent Oliver Moody has been diving into the future of NATO. Good morning, Oliver.
Good morning.
First of all, I think we should compare this sort of chapter of crisis for NATO to perhaps previous difficulties. You've mentioned the Suez debacle in 1956. Just compare and contrast for us where we stand today.
I think you could go back to Suez, where famously France and Britain were conducting quite a successful military operation with Israel against Nasser's government in Egypt, and then Eisenhower, as the US president, effectively pulled the plug out from the whole thing. But really, you have to go right back to the beginning of the alliance a few years earlier, where the Americans only entered it with the utmost reluctance and were convinced that they'd only need to be around for about 10 years before the Europeans could build up enough combat capacity to manage on their own, which sounds extremely familiar in the Trumpian era.
In terms of, I suppose, the credibility of Trump's policy shifts having real-world security implications, is it credible, for example, that the US would choose not to defend a European ally if interests were not aligned? And I guess to just bolt onto that question, Oliver, is the fact that Trump will only be president for what, another 3.5 years or so. And so this could all shift again post-Trump, I suppose.
So that scenario you mentioned where the US is still in NATO and Russia attacks frontline NATO states and the US refuses to go and defend it, it's plausible to the point where at least three governments that I spoke to said that they'd quietly started planning for what happens in that scenario and how on earth you make NATO work without the Americans. So this is very serious and something that is being taken with a great degree of earnestness. And the second question, whether we can just sort of sit around and wait for this to blow over and then hopefully we'll get some sort of Biden 2.0 president. No one that we've spoken to in European governments or diplomatic services or militaries is kidding themselves that whatever comes after Trump will be materially different. If the US pulls troops out of Europe, it's highly unlikely that they will be coming back anytime in the years after Trump.
What futures do you sort of foresee, based on your conversations for this piece? What plausible futures are there for NATO over the course of the next few years, perhaps as 2030 in mind? Is it about status quo? Is it about European strength in all of this? What are the potential scenarios here?
Well, this was the really encouraging thing about the investigation, and what we really wanted to get at is Trump. His public rhetoric veers around all over the place. I don't get the impression he thinks particularly deeply about the nature of the transatlantic alliance and the kind of fundamentals of the strategy. But the people around him increasingly do. They are getting a lot more kind of serious and strategic about where the US wants this to go and how to get there. And where we're moving towards is that the kind of crucial breaking point later this year or early next year, the Pentagon's review of where it puts all its forces is likely not to be as dramatically bad for Europe as has been feared. But in the long run, the US wants to move towards more of a kind of backstop position where it would be helping the Europeans with some things, but the Europeans would be primarily responsible for deterrence and for fighting the war if it came to it. And as a result, we're going into a transitional period which could last a very long time. We're talking probably more than 10 years, in which the Europeans develop a lot more independent capability while the US is kind of there, kind of notionally providing the deterrence for them. And that is going to mean that the US has a lot of leverage over Europe on other political demands, some things like tech regulation, tariff policy, and even these kind of demands that we've heard from the Vice President J.D. Vance about our own domestic politics.
Oliver, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning. It is a brilliant read on what next for NATO, and the inside accounts from officials and military officers and diplomats and government advisors is how Oliver's pieced all of that together to assess where we are at with NATO. It feels like NATO needs a win, doesn't it? It's got bad PR, and so much of this is about PR. It's difficult. Trump has made it a kind of focal point of his wrath over the last few months. If NATO emerged from something, perhaps Russia v Ukraine, with something of a victory, would that secure its place in its future as well? Have a little read with your digital subscription. Go to thetimes.com, and the best way to find that actually is to search for Oliver Moody in the search box, either online or on the app.
Yeah, that's his.